Good morning. It's 8 a.m. We'll give folks just another minute or two to join. All right, we'll get going. Good morning, everyone who's joined. It's a little after 8, and I see we've got good attendance. So we'll start the program now. This is being recorded and will be available on BGR's website after the event. It'll also be aired on WWNO New Orleans Public Radio in the near future. My name is Ben Dupuy. I'm a member of the BGR Board of Directors and chair of the Breakfast Briefing Committee. I'm pleased to welcome you to BGR's first virtual breakfast briefing of 2022. BGR is a private, nonprofit, independent research organization dedicated to informed public policy making and the effective use of public resources for the improvement of government in the New Orleans metropolitan area. BGR's research, reports, and government monitoring are hallmarks of its public policy work in Jefferson, Orleans, and St. Tammany parishes. Breakfast briefings further BGR's mission by bringing citizens, policymakers, and experts together to discuss issues affecting all of our lives. Today's event begins a special 3-part breakfast briefing series on public safety. It'll bring together data analysts, academic and community experts, and law enforcement leaders, letting you hear directly from them about current problems and potential solutions. We hope their insights will help you stay informed and engaged as our community works towards safer and stronger neighborhoods. We encourage you to share these events on social media with others who may be interested. Please mention @BGRNOLA and use the hashtag BGR briefing. Here to tell us more about the series and today's session, and then moderate the Q&A portion is Becky Mowbray, BGR's new president and CEO.
Thank you, Ben. I'd like to express our gratitude to First Horizon Bank for so generously sponsoring BGR's breakfast briefing series again this year. Your support allows us to create these free events for citizens. We'd also like to thank WWNO New Orleans Public Radio for its promotional assistance. We are excited to kick off this especially timely and informative breakfast briefing series on public safety. In putting this together, we thought hard about what mix of perspectives to include. We know that much has already been said about local crime, its consequences for individuals, families, and neighborhoods, and strategies to address it. Whether you watched the City Council's hearings earlier this year or just had a casual conversation with a neighbor, it is a topic on many people's minds. BGR's approach with this series is to take our community conversation deeper into the facts and analysis relevant to our collective search for solutions. BGR's basic premise is that local public safety challenges and opportunities are multifaceted. This means we must examine both law enforcement and community-based strategies that can lead to safer neighborhoods. We hope you will join us for the entire series and come away with a deeper understanding of the issues and potential avenues for solutions. Registration is free at bgr.org. Today's event focuses on the numbers. We welcome 2 very thoughtful speakers who regularly analyze data trends in our criminal justice system and in the broader community. Our first speaker, Jeff Asher, is a nationally recognized crime data analyst and co-founder of the data analytics firm Datalytics. As a public safety analyst with the New Orleans City Council, Jeff has pioneered data visualizations to provide the public with unique insights into the city's criminal justice system. Before launching his analytics firm, Jeff served as a crime analyst for the City of New Orleans and for the Jefferson Parish Sheriff's Office. Prior to that, he worked as an analyst for the Central Intelligence Agency and for the Department of Defense. Our second speaker, Lamar Garder, leads the data center. Its mission is to provide fully independent, objective, and reliable data for informed decision-making in Southeast Louisiana. In his previous role as the City of New Orleans' Chief Information Officer, he was nationally recognized for his work developing the city's first ever data policy and for making resources available through the city's open data portal. Lamar's earlier years were spent as a researcher with the Georgia Institute of Technology and with Intel Corp's research division. So let's get started. We welcome Jeff Asher to the screen. After Jeff discusses crime, policing, and criminal justice trends, Lamar will join us to present information on broader social, economic, and other factors that influence public safety. Following their presentations, we will have time for questions from the audience. Webinar attendees can submit a question by submitting the Q&A icon at the bottom center of your Zoom screen. Just type your question into the box that appears and hit return. Jeff, thank you tremendously for joining us today. The BGR breakfast briefing floor is yours.
Thank you, and thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here, everybody. I'm Jeff Asher. I'm co-founder of Age Datalytics. We do data analytics work for a variety of law enforcement and criminal justice agencies, as well as nonprofits. In New Orleans, we're engaged working with both the New Orleans City Council and the Orleans Parish District Attorney's Office, providing data analytics consulting to them. And I'm here today to present on the crime trends and the criminal justice trends that we've been seeing over the last few years. I guess it's my role to make everybody depressed about our current trends, and then I'll turn it over to Lamar, who hopefully will build everybody up and make everybody feel good about them. So I'm going to be presenting from a series of dashboards that we have built for the New Orleans City Council. I can thank Lamar for these dashboards. For the most part, they rely on the city's publicly available open data. And all these dashboards you can find on the New Orleans City Council's website. So if you go to the City Council Criminal Justice Committee, you can find all of these dashboards and look at all the data and more. When we're talking about New Orleans trends, the first thing that I think is important to pull up to recognize is that crime overall is down. And this is not just a New Orleans thing, this is a national thing. And the reason that it is largely the coronavirus. You can see, and for those of you on the radio, if you go to the council's website, the first page here shows the decline in crime overall, major crime in New Orleans, based on the FBI's definition over the last 2 years since the start of the coronavirus. This is largely a reflection on reduced mobility. Most crimes are crimes of randomness. You need people out on Bourbon Street to have pickpockets. You need people shopping in stores to have shopliftings. So these things having been declining over the last 2 years as people aren't going out quite as much has led to a decrease in crime. The vast majority, about 80% of crimes, are going to be these property crimes. These are not the crimes that people tend to think about because they don't have the impact on society that crimes that are maybe more rare, substantially more rare. There's far fewer shootings each year than auto thefts or shopliftings, but they have a much bigger impact on us as a community. So focusing instead on shootings, you start to see some of the negative trend develop. Shootings are about 11-12% up this year relative to the same time frame in 2021. I would caution against using year-to-date data early in the year. Usually you need months when, if it's not the peak of hurricane season, you probably shouldn't be using year-to-date data, just because lots of things can happen over the course of a year, and a small change at the beginning of the year can look like a big percentage change that doesn't matter as much over the end of the year. But with gun violence, the issue is not so much that we're seeing a year-to-date change, but that over the last 2 years, we've seen a dramatic increase in gun violence in New Orleans. It really started in the summer of 2020, and we've reached a point where over much of the last 2 years, we've averaged about 2 people shot per day, compared to in the year 2019, when New Orleans had only 121 murders, the fewest murders the city had reported since the 1970s. We had about little more than one person shot per day. So we've seen this dramatic increase. It does reflect a national trend. There has been an increase in gun violence, an increase in murder nationally. In 2020, the last year that we have full year data from the FBI, murder increased 30% nationally. And this happened in red states, it happened in blue states, it happened in counties that voted for Trump, it happened for counties that voted for Biden, it happened in big cities, it happened in small suburbs. So it really happened everywhere, which doesn't excuse it happening here. It doesn't mean that this is some sort of issue that we shouldn't address. It just suggests that the trend is not inherently driven by solely local factors. And I think that that's important for considering what it is that we want to do going forward. So gun violence is obviously the number one issue in the city of New Orleans in terms of the most important crime that we would want to reduce. New Orleans has had the top 5 in terms of murder rate per city per 100,000 for basically every year of my lifetime, and I'm 38 years old. The city of New Orleans over the last 12 months has had a higher murder rate than the city of Baltimore. And Baltimore has had the second highest murder rate in the country after St. Louis. It's had a significant increase in violence since Freddie Gray was killed in 2015. New Orleans has basically reached that level of violence over the last year. It's really an everyday tragedy that we see playing out on our streets. And it's something that when you talk about the most important thing that we need to be able to address, it's definitely gun violence, and it's definitely not something that we have a handle on. The next thing I want to talk about is carjackings, because I know that this is something that's been on everybody's mind. We have obviously seen a dramatic uptick in carjackings, both in terms of this year and relative to previous years. Again, this trend began in the summer of 2020. And it's a relatively small number of incidents. You're talking about 300 incidents in a city that has 18,000 or so crimes each year. So in terms of the percentage of crimes, it's reasonably small, and it's reasonably rare events, less than one a day, but it's the type of event that has an oversized impact on our community. It's something that is also a changing trend in terms of it's increasing, and it's something that's very difficult, I think, to get a handle on. There's all this discussion about juvenile carjackings as a main culprit. It's not that juveniles aren't committing these crimes. The share of juveniles that are arrested for these crimes has gone from something like 20% to something like 45% over the last 2 years. So it's a changing trend. We have seen more juveniles involved, but it is something that is primarily driven by adults when we see arrests. The other thing to point out about carjackings is that relative to armed robberies, they're reasonably rare. Armed robberies, where there's not a vehicle involved, have traditionally outnumbered carjackings 2 or 3 to 1. That ratio has dropped over the last few years. It's largely because armed robberies have fallen. In 2016, NOPD instituted the Tiger Unit, and this was focused largely on serial armed robbers. And it's had a dramatic impact. It had immediately a dramatic impact. And that impact has somehow been sustained over the last few years. So we've seen this big upswing in carjackings, but a decline in armed robberies, which is certainly an interesting trend to look at. And the last crime trend, before I move on to incarceration, is vehicle burglaries. Again, vehicle burglaries, probably everybody on this call has either had their vehicle broken into or knows somebody whose vehicle was broken into. These increased dramatically starting in 2018, totally unrelated to the pandemic. Similar to carjackings, vehicle burglaries and carjackings are the two crimes where they're not entirely driven by juveniles, but the share of incidents involving a juvenile, arrests involving a juvenile, has gone from, again, somewhere in the 15 to 20% range before the surge to about 40 to 50% after the surge. And one thing when trying to assess vehicle burglaries that's important to mention, an arrest is made in less than 10% of vehicle burglaries. So when we talk about our understanding of vehicle burglaries, it's largely driven by the tiny share of incidents that lead to an arrest. Vehicle burglaries peaked in the beginning of 2020, declined with the coronavirus beginning in March 2020, and are sort of at this level where we're averaging about 5,500 to 5,000 to 6,000 per year over the last 2 years. That's pretty much double where we were in the 2015-2016 range, but down from the nearly 7,000 that we had in 2019. So we've seen a decline, but we're still at a very high level. And you consider, carjackings, we have 200 to 300 maybe in a really bad year. Vehicle burglaries, we have about 6,000. So these are much less rare events. And they're something that I think are very difficult to get a hold of, because it's hard to deliver any type of means of stopping these if you're only making an arrest in 8 to 10%. The literature is very clear that deterrence occurs when people believe that there will be a swift reaction from the police, and that the likelihood of arrest is very high. And so when you've got an incident like this, which has a lot of incidents and very few of them are leading to arrest, it's hard to get deterrence in any sort of way. And then I know I've only got a few more minutes, but the last thing that I want to talk about before handing over to Lamar is the incarceration population. New Orleans has, in addition to being the murder capital of the country, traditionally has been the incarceration capital of the country. Prior to Katrina in May, I believe, 2005, we had about 7,000 people in custody of the sheriff's office. That declined significantly with Katrina. It ticked up to nearly 4,000 in the years after Katrina. And then under the Lamar administration, there began a concerted effort to reduce the incarceration population. And so in 2010, there were about 3,500 people incarcerated. We had a historic low of 720 in 2021 last year. We're at 903 today. Again, some of the latter half of the decline is due to the coronavirus and letting people out. But for the most part, this is not a COVID-driven change. This is largely a change driven by intentional policy to reduce incarceration. And the rationale here is that we can reduce incarceration not by, we're not going to arrest murderers, we're not going to arrest violent criminals, but we're going to stop making the arrests of the type where we're putting people in jail for low-level offenses. And so something like 60 to 65% of the people that are currently incarcerated today are incarcerated on a violent offense: criminal homicide, aggravated assault, robbery, rape. So the decline in incarceration has happened because we're making fewer arrests in things like misdemeanor drug violations. And so I've clicked on the misdemeanor drug violation tab, and you can see that from mid-2009 to mid-2010, there were nearly 2,000 people arrested where their most serious offense was a misdemeanor drug violation. Over the last year, there have been 25 such people arrested. Traffic offenses, another one. 9,000 people in 2009 that were arrested where a traffic violation was their most serious offense. Over the last year, that number is 237. And I think that this is important because we've seen this dramatic decline in incarceration at the same time as there was a dramatic decline in gun violence, or no associated increase in gun violence. Now, obviously, we've had a big increase in gun violence over the last 2 years, but this is largely disassociated with the decline in incarceration. I think this is really important to show because it's evidence that we can decrease incarceration at the same time as decreasing gun violence. And so as we think about how do we address the rise in gun violence, it's very important to show that locking people up for really the small violations is not related at all to the solutions that we should be looking for, and that the sort of tough on crime, lock people up and throw away the key is not going to be our answer. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Lamar, Lamar Garder of the data center. And there we go. Lamar, over to you.
Well, thanks, Jeff. I appreciate that. And I want to say thank you to BGR's board and leadership for inviting the data center to this important conversation. Again, I'm Lamar Garder, the data center's executive director. The data center is a data intermediary that's been operating since about 1997 to produce good data and research about our region to help move us forward towards better and greater prosperity. We have a lot to share today, so I'll try to move quickly into the topic. So often folks do have these questions about what's causing all the violent crime issues that we've had in our city or even across the nation. And it turns out that this is a thing that's actually been pretty well understood for quite a while. As far back as the 2nd century, Roman leaders understood that poverty is the mother of crime. Now, it's in the recent 50 years or so that Nobel Prize-winning economist Gary Becker has helped us to better understand that there's a relationship not only between poverty and crime, but between inequality and crime. The gaps between the rich and poor help to drive crime in a significant way, particularly violent crime. It's also very important to understand that as it relates to changes in violent crime and when trends shift directions and things like that, much of that is sometimes related to disasters. Disasters do exacerbate existing trends. And so if crime is on a slight increase and then a disaster happens, then that might cause crime to spike, or any other issue in society to spike. In general, while it's not totally clear how disasters affect crime, what we do know is that disasters do tend to widen gaps between the rich and poor, which again would exacerbate any of the other issues that come along with inequality. And when we say disasters, we should really be thinking broadly. These are not just things like natural disasters, like the ongoing effects of climate change, or events like hurricanes, fires, droughts, or the pandemic. It's also things like economic disasters, like the Great Recession from 2008, or again, the pandemic, which has been an economic disaster as well, or longer term, more structural issues, like the US economy in the way that it has changed recently, such that many of its middle-class jobs are simply not available in the way that they used to be historically. And then there are social disasters that happen as well. We've seen many things recently related to politics or other key aspects of society that have led to some having a loss of confidence in, for example, local policing or in government's ability to meet needs. Each of these disasters affect the way society operates in a certain way, and again, tend to exacerbate existing trends. It's not that only these few things affect crime. Many other things are related to crime, anything from environmental contamination in poor neighborhoods to weak regional education systems may affect crime. But remember, many of these things are also very closely tied to poverty. So in terms of inequality, how does New Orleans look? Well, according to 2019 data, just before the pandemic, New Orleans was ranked 4th in terms of large cities, in terms of income inequality. So pretty high on the list of inequality there. How did we get that way? Well, if we go back to the beginning, it's interesting that New Orleans was actually a city that did very well in terms of equality. There was low segregation, and it being founded in French and Spanish traditions meant that there were relatively more rights afforded to the enslaved and people of color. Unfortunately, by about the 1840s, the state began to change some of those laws, became increasingly restrictive to people of color. Then the Jim Crow era set in, where it became very, very difficult for people of color to participate fully in the economy. And if we kind of start from there, we can start to look at what data looks like from sort of the end of the Jim Crow era to now. So from the late 70s, we can see already that there's a gap in income between Black and white, right? We can see it very, very significantly back then. Unfortunately, the 40 years after that, 40 years or so after that, that gap has only increased, such that Black households earn 63% less and Hispanic households 47% less than white households by 2016. Half of all Black families at that point in New Orleans earn less than $25,000. The most recent data on this this issue is not significantly different. Slightly higher income for Black families, significantly higher income for white families. And so again, that trend of widening income inequality has continued. If you take a deeper look at what caused those trajectories to look different over the years, you can see that the share of white households in the highest income quintiles has grown from 24% in 1979 to 29% in 2016. The share of Black households in this tier has shrunk from 9% to 6%. Black households in the lowest tier grew from 41% to 47% by 2016. And white households in this lowest tier shrank from 23% to 14%. So when you see these changes at these different tiers, you start to get a sense of how income is shifting for families and how that might be adding additional pressure to those folks who are on the wrong side of those shifts. Of course, if income continues to be a problem, then wealth accumulation would also be a problem, particularly for Black families. In New Orleans, Black New Orleanians are nearly 2.5 times more likely to be in liquid asset poverty, and more than twice as likely to be in a household with zero net worth than their white peers. This means that folks either don't own a home, so don't have an asset that's growing in equity, don't have much money in the bank, maybe have high levels of debt. It might be student loan debt or other types of debt, but don't have very many assets to their name that could be leveraged or used to their benefit or to weather those shocks and stresses that happen in our lives, like needing to pay for a loved one's healthcare issues and things like that. So this all suggests that there is an impact on poverty levels in our region, right? If there's low levels of income. And in the New Orleans metro area, poverty rates are high. 28% of Black, 21% of Hispanic, and only 10% of white people live in poverty in our region. The poverty rate for Black people is 3 times the level of white, and for Hispanic, 2 times the level of white. Black rates in, poverty rates rather, in New Orleans for Blacks are higher than in the metro, which in turn is higher than in the United States. And if you look at that in New Orleans over that same 40-year time span that I mentioned before, you can see that unfortunately, child poverty rates, so obviously if the parents or household income is low and people are in poverty, then there's going to be a certain number of children, obviously, that are in poverty as well. Unfortunately, over that 40-year span, the poverty rate for African-American children from 1980 to now has been unchanged, largely unchanged over that 40-year period, despite a lot of great efforts to try to make a dent. It's been unchanged over that effort, over that time period. Nearly half of all African-American children live in poverty, while about 9% of white children live in poverty. Now, this is important because poverty tends to be sticky. When you're born into poverty and you live in a neighborhood that is a low-income neighborhood, it becomes very difficult to pull yourselves out of poverty. In fact, if you are born into a household that is at the 25th income percentile, right, the bottom quarter, and you live in a low-income neighborhood, on average, you can expect to only make it to the 29th percentile in terms of income in your adulthood if you are Black. If you are living in that circumstance and you are white, you can expect on average to make it to the 40th income percentile. Now that's by contrast that if you are still, born into a household at the 25th percentile and you're Black, but you live in a neighborhood that is a higher income neighborhood, then you have a greater chance of ending up as an adult in a higher income situation. Still, for a Black person in that situation, the number is still only in the 37th income quintile or so, or percentile. If you are white, then you have an opportunity on average to be at the 53rd percentile. So again, we see that because poverty is sticky, it depends to some extent where you live. The place where you live can help determine your outcome and your success in terms of income on into adulthood. And so just like in many cities that suffer from high inequality, as New Orleans does, the relationship between adult income levels, the demographics of the neighborhood that you live in, all combine to affect your life expectancy. Lower earning adults who live in majority Black neighborhoods in New Orleans have a lower life expectancy than those higher earning adults living in majority non-Black neighborhoods. Life expectancy is not just a measure of how long you'll live, you're expected to live. It's actually an indicator of overall quality of life. And so what we're saying is that if you are born into poverty in New Orleans and into neighborhoods that are not high income neighborhoods, then you will in general experience lower quality of life, or there's a higher chance that you will experience lower quality of life over your lifespan. So this issue, this conversation around poverty brings up an important nuance to it, right? That what's really important is the living wage, right? The amount of money that you need to earn to live without assistance, live a comfortable life, no frills, just make it in New Orleans. And in 2016, that number for one adult and one child was $22.89 per hour. Roughly 71% of Black families did not live above that threshold. They live below that threshold. By 2019, or rather 2021, I'm sorry, that living wage number has grown from $22.89 per hour to $32 for one adult, one child in New Orleans. So we see the cost of living going up, but incomes not matching that increase. If you want to get straight to the heart of the matter of what has happened in New Orleans, from 1980 to now, you see a significant drop in employment for Black males. If you look more closely, from 1980 to 1990, as the port begins to have trouble and the oil and gas industry begins to fade, the city loses a significant number of good-paying middle-class jobs. And men, Black, white, and Hispanic alike, all suffered employment losses during that time. By 1990, employment for white men and employment for Hispanic men begins to rebound and continues to move upward until recent times. It's only for Black men does employment fail to rebound at all and continue to decline until recent times. And so by the time we get to 2020 or so, we have an epidemic of poor employment for Black males, which drives many of the poverty issues and related crime issues and inequality issues that we see here in our city. New Orleans is somewhat unique in this situation as it relates to groups of cities that we refer to as aspirational metros, like cities that we're trying to be like. About 67% of Black males are employed. When you look at weak city metros, those who haven't been experiencing any growth, about 59% of Black males are employed. In New Orleans, that number in 2016 was down to 56%. And remember, it fell from the 1980s and never recovered here in New Orleans. So, when you are looking at these issues around crime, it's important to understand that it's poverty coupled with inequality that's considered the primary driver of violent crime. Fortunately, there are accessible ways to address the problem. Now, reversing the effects of generational poverty is not a quick fix. It takes a good bit of time, but there are several tools that have proven to be effective. The expanded child tax credit recently that we saw during the pandemic did help to lift some folks out of poverty, and that's because it was very easy to access and had a low number of restrictions. The state, by expanding a number of existing social safety net programs, could also significantly reduce child poverty in the state. Also, factors such as the low minimum wage here in our state also does help depress wages and create greater income inequality. Now, sometimes folks get concerned that these social safety net programs might lead to losses in the labor market or low labor participation. A number of Nobel Prize winning economists, numerous studies have shown that these social safety net programs actually do not lead to lower levels of work. And so in the end, even though temporary fixes may be needed to quickly disrupt current levels of violence, a long-term investment in New Orleans' people is what's needed truly to break the cyclical rise of violent crime in our city. And so with that, I'll pass it back to Becky. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thanks again to both of you for sharing your thoughts and insights with us. It is now time to shift to the traditional audience Q&A portion of the program. And if Jeff, if you could, if you and Lamar could both turn your cameras back on, we will be transitioning. We have a few questions that audience members have submitted in advance, as well as new ones asked today. If you would like to ask a question, please click on the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. Type your question in the box and hit return. Okay, so first question is for both of you. What are some of the biggest misconceptions about crime trends in New Orleans?
Pretty much all of them, I would say. It's boy, that is a good question. I guess I'll go that I don't know that this is the biggest, but it's usually the one that bugs me the most as someone who looks at the data, that the murders spike in New Orleans, as the weather gets hot, everybody gets pissed off and starts shooting themselves. And I think that if you look at the data in Northern City, if you're looking at Chicago's data, that's absolutely true, that the weather has a major impact on gun violence. But in a place like New Orleans, where it's always, except for a few days a year, maybe, at least decent enough to be outside, that there's no relationship between the temperature and whether or not shootings are up or down. And that's largely a factor of the shootings get depressed when people go inside, and they only go inside when it's really cold. So that I guess is one misconception that tends to bother me. I don't know that it's inherently the biggest though.
Lamar?
So I think one of the primary misconceptions is that it's difficult to say. It's many things that folks talk about, but there seems to be a thought often that it's a decision that people are making, right, to be involved in violent crime or to live a life of crime. But what the data suggests is that people are placed into increasingly desperate circumstances, and then find their way into crime-oriented situations that eventually, in some cases, do unfortunately lead to violent activities and things like that. But it's very important to understand that there are many systems, from the way the criminal justice system operates to the education system to the way our economy makes available certain kinds of jobs, that place many New Orleanians in a difficult situation related to their household income and poverty, which makes, unfortunately, crime and violence much more likely as desperate situations increase in people's lives.
Thank you. Another question for both of you. Are we measuring the right things? In each of your areas, what metrics should citizens and policymakers pay most attention to?
I guess I'll jump in first there. So, according to the presentation that we just saw, poverty is one of the key things that we need to look at. We need to look at how well our systems are doing to provide family-sustaining jobs for the people that live here. How good of a job is our education system doing in preparing our young folks for the types of job opportunities that may be available now or on into the future. I think often we end up using the metrics around law enforcement or around crime to measure things. That's the endpoint, right? Where you see the poor outcomes related to poverty. What we should be doing is looking higher up in that pipeline to see how those various systems that impact people are working to produce opportunity and prosperity for people. If those higher up metrics don't look good, then we're going to end up with poor outcomes down the line.
Yeah, I fully agree with Lamar that we measure crime trends and incarceration because that's the endpoint that we have. Those are the scenarios where the system has failed. Somebody's been shot, somebody's been incarcerated and arrested. So I think that the things that we need to be able to measure are how well is our system, just looking at it from the criminal justice standpoint, how well is our system preventing these things from happening again? What is our clearance rate? What are the recidivism rate? Sticking just with the criminal justice side, there's all sorts of different metrics, which is not to say that we're not measuring them. It's just sort of easiest to rely on there were X number of crimes or there were, Y number of people arrested. But I definitely think that what we need is a holistic system of measurement that doesn't rely on one or two metrics as the evidence of success.
Great. And related data question for Jeff. Jeff, what could improve criminal justice data collection and data systems in New Orleans?
I think a lot of things. New Orleans, this is going to shock people, but has traditionally been an archaic data collection system in the criminal justice system. A lot of what we have now is improvements that began under the Landry administration under Lamar. So I'll give full credit there that things have improved significantly, but that things are still a mess in a lot of ways. Systems don't inherently talk to one another. The criminal justice system does not have easily connected tables and ways of understanding things. We're a decade removed from an OPD taking things down by hand. So we are not really experienced longtime users of technology to collect data. And so I think that ensuring that we're collecting appropriate data, and I think that the open data that the city has, New Orleans has been a leader in open data, ensuring that New Orleans remains a leader in data transparency for the sake of transparency. It allows things like our dashboards. It allows the public to understand what is working, what is not working, continuing to expand those open data systems. The average citizen may not look at 1 million rows of stop and search data, but there may be a journalist or a researcher or somebody that's really important to. So the more we can do to open up our data systems, because it's not NOPD's criminal justice system. It's not the criminal district court's criminal justice system. It really is ours as a community.
Thank you. Another question for both of you. What can New Orleans learn from other places to achieve lower levels of violent crime? What models can we look to?
Oh, that is a difficult question, in part because there are not many places that have managed to solve problems around racial disparities and inequalities. And so in places where there are significant numbers of minorities, it has been hard to see long-term changes, long-term gains in violent crime, because that persistent poverty and inequality continues to exist. There are cities like New York who did turn things around, but also New York's demographics significantly changed. There was a significant amount of gentrification that happened in New York, where poor people were moved out and higher income people in, and that naturally did change their statistics around crime. And so it is a very difficult question, but there are a number of cities these days that are and states that are working to implement policies that would help to lift people out of poverty so that they are able to have children in environments where they can get early childcare, where they can go to school in a safe manner and come home and study in a household that's not racked by poverty. In any of those cities, there are a few who have made strides in poverty, particularly child poverty. That's where there's some good opportunities to look for what we can do to improve our long-term conditions around crime.
I would agree with Lamar that there's not a city that you can point to, especially now in terms of violence reduction, where it really is sort of a uniform increase. There's nowhere that is implementing strategies that we can copy to reduce violence. Places like Oakland that prior to the pandemic had success in reducing violence, largely through being very targeted in their interventions. And we know that gun violence is sticky. It happens to the same people. It happens in the same places over and over again. So the more targeted you can be in your interventions, especially non-law enforcement interventions, so building societal programs, building ways of stopping people from committing gun violence, I think the more successful you're going to be. We're New Orleans. We don't do anything like anybody else. So I think that there's no reason we have to rely on another city to find our solutions, that we can come up with New Orleans centric solutions based on our own ingenuity and our own problems.
Great. We have a couple of questions related to mental health that I'm going to bundle together, and they're for both of you. First, what role does trauma play in crime, and what do we know about the level of trauma in New Orleans? And then nationally, advocates calling for replacing police officers with social workers to respond to 911 calls for mental health crises often refer to the figure that people with mental illness are 16 times more likely to be killed by police. What is our local NOPD data on police shootings and killings for people who have serious mental illness?
I'm going to take the easier question because I don't have the data on the NOPD shootings. The easy and I think unfortunate question is that New Orleans obviously significantly suffers from trauma, whether it be related to Hurricane Katrina and some of the very terrible things that happened related there, or going much farther back in terms of just generational poverty. There is trauma that exists in this city related to housing policy that forced people to live in areas of the city that are either not safe or would encourage or contribute to them remaining in poverty long term. Poverty itself produces a certain kind of trauma that has been shown to affect the brain structure of particularly children. And so when you grow up in that situation, there is trauma that continues on from being raised in that situation. It's not that your brain can't change over time, but you have to have your context change, which we've already said. Poverty tends to be sticky and it's hard to move out of that. And so there are certainly elements of trauma that exist within our population, which makes it very difficult for people to overcome the already difficult circumstances that they are in. I don't have a number on exactly how much trauma there is or how it differs from other cities, but being born and raised here, and anyone that you talk to who's been here for a long time, you know that there are many and long-lasting traumatic circumstances that affects your typical New Orleans.
Yeah, so I don't have the statistics on use of force either, but to Lamar's point, yeah, absolutely, trauma is an enormous driver of gun violence. You've got 60-something years of New Orleans having one of the highest murder rates in the country. In the 90s, in like 1991, 1% of Black men aged 19 to 20 were killed in New Orleans. You've got decades of over-incarceration, where thousands of people were incarcerated, and then for the kids that are 17 today were the ones that were born right at Katrina. So you've got Katrina, and then an enormous economic recession, and then the coronavirus. So we're talking about an enormous amount of trauma that impacts the people's lives that are engaged in gun violence. And we know that gun violence acts as a disease. So if you know somebody that's been affected by gun violence, it dramatically increases the risk that at some point you'll be involved in gun violence, either as a victim or as a perpetrator. So I think that addressing those traumas and doing our best to reduce them going forward, reduce gun violence and reduce incarceration, is our best strategy for addressing gun violence in a generational standpoint. As far as mental health goes, I don't have the exact number of NOPD shootings either, but that number has fallen dramatically under the consent decree. In the 90s, NOPD was shooting and killing something like 40 to 60 people a year. Now, a shooting that results in somebody dead is usually rare, maybe 1 or 2 a year, but there have been many years since the consent decree was implemented that there have been 0 fatal police shootings. So that has decreased a lot, largely because of policy changes and how firearms are being deployed these days. As far as using non-police responders to mental health calls, I'm all for it. I think that people tend to overstate the amount of those calls that you can get people to respond to. Just having one where you're reducing the likelihood of some sort of police shooting by successfully deploying a mental health responder rather than a police officer is good, but it's largely a drop in the bucket compared to how many of these calls there might be. Denver, which is probably the most famous example right now with their STAR program, you're talking about 3,000 calls or so over the last 2 years, out of several million total incidents that Denver police could have responded to. So reasonably small number, but conceptually very good. The type of thing that I think requires a lot of thought, though, and requires a lot of effort to ensure that the appropriate responder is being sent.
Terrific. Lamar, we have several questions related to economic opportunity. Let's see. Where was that? Lamar, what have been the most prominent hurdles to building local wealth and prosperity? And what type of programs, if any, are out there to help with wage depression and the poor employment epidemic problem that you mentioned, and what seemed to be the most effective?
Yes, yes. Jeff, during his talk, mentioned one particular thing that's been problematic in New Orleans, and it's over-incarceration. Many people have been incarcerated over the last 40 years or so in New Orleans, as we've become the most incarcerated place in the world. And that condition of incarceration makes it harder for you, even after you've served your time, makes it harder for you to gain employment down the line. If you add to that the fact that our economy has lost many of the kinds of jobs that would be needed for folks who have some sort of record in their past to get access to a job that pays a good family sustaining wage. Many of those jobs don't quite exist the way that they did in the 70s or so, when we were doing better, and there were more jobs available at the port, and there were more oil and gas jobs where you could walk into and earn a good living. And so what this leads to is, not only systemic issues that over-incarcerate and put people in place in a situation where they're not qualified in some cases, they're not eligible for certain kinds of jobs. The structure of our economy and the kinds of jobs that we have and the leading industries that we have, even if you got a job, meant that you're not likely to earn enough to raise yourself out of poverty in many situations. Some of those lost jobs in the 80s were replaced with hospitality jobs. Hospitality jobs are great for certain types of situations, but don't have the ability to sustain people over a long time in a job that would allow them to grow and be promoted significantly and develop a broad set of skills in ways that would support their family long term. And we have a lot of those hospitality jobs, which continues to be one of the barriers for people getting access to employment that would lift them out of poverty in New Orleans. I'm sorry, Becky, what was the second part of that question?
I think you've covered it. We're going to move on to another question for Jeff. Jeff, we've got a couple of questions related to NOPD, and I'm going to bundle them together. What does the research tell us about the effectiveness of crime cameras, and are there other areas where technology has made a significant difference? And then the second one is related to the size of the force. We often hear that NOPD is significantly understaffed. What do data and research tell us about the department's needs for more officers?
Good questions. So crime cameras, the research is very, very clear that they work for very specific crime types, usually auto theft and vehicle burglary. if you've got enough of them, and if you can respond to them in near real time. They don't really work if you have no sort of response, because then whoever might use them, whoever might be seen on the camera knows that, what's the point of the camera? They're going to get grainy footage of somebody that they can't really make out. But in certain circumstances, like in parking lots, they can help as a deterrent in lowering auto-based crimes, thefts and burglaries. All other crime, though, there's really not much evidence that they do much. And you can kind of see that they have, a couple hundred maybe cameras. I don't know the exact number of cameras, but each camera maybe covers less than a block. The likelihood of actually getting footage that deters somebody that leads to an arrest is reasonably low. And so there's not a ton of evidence inherently that it's sort of like, the argument is if you have 15,000 of them, you might have a real effect. But I don't think anybody's arguing that we want 15,000, because then you're having a significant trade-off with the civil liberties issues. As far as NOPD goes, right now NOPD has 1,017 commissioned officers. Before coronavirus, it had about 1,150. So that's significantly lower, and NOPD only has 30 recruits right now. So you're talking about a force that is struggling to keep up. There's no exact number as far as what you'd say the force needs. We had about 1,500 before Katrina. Obviously, that force was woefully ineffective. It was poorly run and led to a consent decree and many tragic overuses of power in the days after Katrina, months after Katrina. So it's not like the effectiveness of the force is determined by the number of officers. At the same time, only having 1,017 officers, we've seen skyrocketing response times. A lot of the things, we had challenges with having enough officers out there to patrol during Mardi Gras. There are real trade-offs to having a smaller force. And so we have to be cognizant that there has to be a balance between having a force that can do the things that we want the police department to be able to do, while also acknowledging that having 1,600 officers is not the cure for all our woes. And then it's really hard to hire police right now. So hiring 1,600 officers is a lot easier to say, we're just going to hire 500 or 600 more. Actually doing that is really, really hard. And OPD and the Police and Justice Foundation had this enormous effort to hire officers in 2018, 2019, and they hired about 100. They grew by 100, and that was really good. But we should temper our expectations here that if the city's able to add 100 or 200 more, as far as effective performance, that would be good. But I wouldn't put a number on exactly how many we should have, because we're all going to fall short of that.
We're down to our last few questions. What can be done in the short term to make the city more safe? And what can citizens coalesce around to reduce crime?
Go ahead,
Turn it
Lamar.
over to Jeff. You're the deeper expert on those things than me.
I don't know that there's inherently anything that the city can do in the immediate term to reduce crime. I think focusing on improving the share of incidents that are solved is sort of the best deterrent we have. And then identifying individuals that are, where are the places and people that this keeps occurring to, and finding ways of intervening. I don't know that any of those can be done effectively in the short term, though. I think that, as Lamar talked about, we have really big generational problems, and until we start to solve those, you can't just put a Band-Aid on this and expect things to go down in a sustainable way. Sorry, that's probably the most depressing answer I've given today.
I don't have anything else to add to that. It's the case that it's going to be a long slog to change our economic dynamics in our cities such that we have a population that can be more prosperous. And until that's the case, we'd have a hard time, really shifting the tide in crime. As Jeff said, clearance rates, do make a difference, but we've got to solve those long-term generational poverty issues.
This is another one for both of you. If you controlled the city budget, where would you spend money if your goal was to increase public safety?
So if we were, thinking very, very long term, I would do what I needed to fund the education system, the early childcare education, and K through 12 system at much, much higher levels than they are now. It is through the education system that there is going to be the greatest opportunity to get people in position where they are not in desperate circumstances where they have to turn to crime later in life. What I would also do is continue on and maybe expand current pilots around guaranteed income to make sure that certain very vulnerable populations do not slip into poverty. If you can keep folks, particularly children, out of poverty, you have a much better chance of those children getting a good education that can then be the bedrock of them being able to get good jobs, which leads to better quality of life, better family structures, and lower crime long term. So those are the things so long term, funding education, short term, a guaranteed basic income, I think is something that for specific populations is something that we should really be looking at to stabilize the folks that are most vulnerable. Similarly, around housing, we've got to stabilize the cost of housing as well, so people are not vulnerable in that situation.
Okay, Jeff, anything to add?
I mean, I would focus on gun violence with a laser, and knowing how concentrated it can be, work to find out what interventions work for people. And so whether that's universal income, whatever it is, I think the city should invest, and we don't know what works. And so the city should be investing in a large amount of different types of interventions, and then measure the hell out of them, figure out what is working for reducing violence, what is not working for reducing violence. Don't invest in the things that aren't working. Put your millions of dollars into the things that are working, with the understanding that for violence reduction, we don't inherently need hundreds of thousands of people to be served by interventions. We're really looking at a couple hundred or a couple thousand people that would be most effective for reducing violence. And a lot of the input data is going to have to come from the criminal justice system, but I think that the output, the interventions can be entirely non-law enforcement focused. And so I think that is a means of figuring out what will work for us at budgetary levels that we've never seen before. Usually you're talking about a couple $100,000, a couple of interrupters or something like that. We spend $200 million each year on NOPD's budget. If we spent $50 million a year on non-law enforcement interventions, it could plausibly have a much larger societal impact on reducing gun violence, in my opinion.
Thank you. I'm afraid that's all the time we have for questions. Thank you, Jeff and Lamar, for speaking with us today. Thanks again. You're welcome. Thanks again to First Horizon Bank for its generous sponsorship of this breakfast briefing. And thanks to all of you for being with us this morning. A recording of today's BGR breakfast briefing will be available on our website, bgr.org. It will also be rebroadcast on WWNO New Orleans Public Radio in the coming weeks. The best way to stay on top of all BGR events and research is to become a member. We regularly engage with our members about our public policy work, and we value this dialogue. We also rely on our members to help amplify BGR's policy recommendations. If you're not currently a member, visit bgr.org to join the ranks of concerned citizens working to improve local government. We thank you for participating in this event and for staying engaged in public policy discussions important to our community. Have a great day, and we hope to see you at the next two events in this special series and at future BGR breakfast briefings.